So Jeff and I, we go back almost 5 years. I've worked with him first with Sphere, and now we're together at Reframe. And I am incredibly grateful for all the profound ways that he's influenced my perspective and truly reshaped and reframed my approach to operations.
So just to give you a sense of my career path and kind of how I came to be here, figuratively and literally, I guess, to some extent. I'm actually an electrical engineer by training. So I went to school for electrical engineering, started my career in R&D organizations, a couple big companies, and got the full experience of working in corporate America. I'm American, by the way, if that wasn't obvious from my accent or lack thereof, depending on your perspective. Yeah, but I spent the first several years of my career in big companies, working in the R&D organizations, and then saw the the good part and the bad parts of large orgs, and then moved on to feeding my entrepreneurial spirit and founding a series of a couple businesses where I was founder and CTO. So really the tech side of things is today's terms would be like VP of engineering, head of product, CTO was my official title. And yeah, I got to learn quite a bit about small companies and how they operated and trying to apply some of that stuff, but mostly as a technologist building tech organizations. And then actually was fortunate enough for one of those businesses to be acquired by one of the major telecoms in the US, and then spent a few years again in a big company as VP of R&D, helping integrate our company into the larger sales force of the big telecom company, and did that for a few years. Again, kind of shifting from this contrast from, in this case now, a sales-driven organization, really, the telecommunications company was. And then went back to startups again as COO now. And this really started the second wave of my career relative to moving from the tech side of businesses more operationally, so in charge of sales and marketing, and as a COO. And so there's a series of roles here, 3 different companies that I did, 2 of them very early stage, one a little bit bigger, and Stack Overflow, which was one of the kind of my claim to fame along the way. A very large exit with that one. Another one exited to Twitter as an earlier acquisition, but got to see the whole, stem to stern, I guess, if we're going to stick with some of the nautical references here, as a sailor, building across, from employee number 4 to 350 people, and tens of millions of dollars in recurring revenue, relatively early on even, and then a big exit with Stack Overflow in particular. And then after really working and doing the COO, partnered with visionary founders, I really found it's time ready in my career at that point to go back to starting something new. Had an idea. This is what led me to Reframe, and now as founder and CEO for the first time, trying to really apply everything that I learned through my career from all these different areas into seeing what I can do to start from a clean slate, employee number 1, if you will, and build a team based around Reframe.
I vividly recall one of our super early conversations where you played a big part of shifting my understanding of operations and strategy, and contrasted roles of a firefighter with that of an architect. At other times, you referred to it as 2 different modes, analyst and dreamer. Can you share a little bit more where your thinking comes from and how your perspective about this has evolved?
Yeah, this is a great question. Kind of a loaded one. I'll try to keep this kind of brief, and maybe just add a little bit more context to some of the background of those. Yeah, so what Aušrine was mentioning is something I talk about is sort of the firefighting mode versus the city planner or sort of architect mode, depending on it. And if you guys saw the one talk that we did at one of the earlier Operations Nation events, it's like COO and what is the job. I actually talked about this a bit in that talk if people wanted to check it out. But to give a little bit more context to this, yeah, Aušrine also mentioned something I talk about this is the analyst versus the dreamer in ourselves is another way to talk about this. But to set more of the context, really one of the things that I observed in my career, so I think a part of your question, if I understood it, was, where did some of this thinking come from, and then how did it evolve? And so, as I was mentioning in my bio, these sort of waves of my career, I saw a lot of different environments from different perspectives. So, both in a product-led organization as a product person, being on the operations side in a product-led company, being in product-led companies versus sales-led companies. And the thing that I always found really interesting, and even just big and small too, and, like you see these dichotomies basically where in a sense, no one company is good at everything. They have their strengths and weaknesses, which on one hand seems sort of natural, but as an engineer and like a systems thinker, I was like, well, why does this kind of keep happening? Like, in other words, why do all companies have this? And I think some of the most successful companies, you might say, almost don't have weak spots. And that's actually very interesting. There's less interesting companies which just kind of fail, outright, which are kind of not good at anything. But then you have almost all companies that have their sort of core strengths and weaknesses. And so there's this sense that I saw that we have this dichotomy or like an asymmetry that develops in companies. And actually, as a COO working with a visionary founder, I also saw this to be somewhat in the balance of like what the founders are typically trying to do, which is like vision led, which often is in a product or services centric thing. And then what we're often doing on the ops side, which is, doing the keeping all the trains running on time, as you will, around that. And obviously, as operational people, we get very frustrated at times with this. I think there's a cool study that you guys did with the stats around this, where something like 75% of ops people are always frustrated with their visionary founder and or their sort of direct reports in this other part of the organization, in a sense. And so you have to ask yourselves why. And I think there's sort of the symptoms of this, and there's the core problem at play here, which is what I've thought a lot about. And I think you have to realize, because the roles change, like, it could be the service half of the business rules or the marketing part of the company rules or the sales led. This is not about the disciplines. There's something in common going on here relative to the underlying humans. And I think part of this is like risk tolerance and time horizons, right? So are we sort of visionary planning founder talking about 5 years from now in this crazy big vision that we have, but then at the same time, we got to keep the trains running on time and close this quarter sales numbers and things like that. I think that's part of it. The risk tolerance is maybe, we want to be operational engineers. We like controlling everything and having very precise plans. And you got loosey-goosey salespeople sometimes, no offense to salespeople, or even visionary founders just sort of talking about things very abstractly with no real execution plan behind it. And this is where it comes into what I like to call the, analysts versus the dreamers. And again, I'm not casting this on any part of the company or the roles or the people, but it's, in a sense, if you have a founder product-led company with a visionary founder, these are the dreamers. They're going out trying to figure out how to make something happen, and everything else is kind of secondary to that. And so then they're surrounded by the analysts. And, another way of talking about this is you got some people sort of driving the company, at least in their perspective of things. This is what we're trying to drive and make happen. And everybody else is around them reacting. And so the city planner, if you will, in the analogy, or the architect is sitting there trying to lay out this very structured high level thing. But then we have to intersect it with like, okay, somebody's trying to do that, not necessarily always fully coherent to what we're trying to get done. And the rest of the organization's reacting around that, either sort of cleaning up the messes in the extreme case. And so that's what you really see happening. And the thing that I've come to really learn about this is the difference between authoring and reacting to things. So how much do we dream and author and use the analyst side of ourselves to sort of think about what might go wrong, but don't sort of like be a traffic cop or block things. Let's think about how to engineer or author ourselves into solutions. And that's really the kind of background of this, is like, what do we do to get all parts of the organization, get rid of this symmetry, authoring basically? And how do we have visionary led and the more operations thing be the same? We're all trying to do the same thing and all be authoring, because we essentially want everybody to be dreamers, making as much happen as possible in that realm.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's incredibly important that everyone in the organization considers that they are writing their own chapter or their own page of the company, because a lot of the times I see operations leaders not really being in control. They want to be in control, but a lot of the times we just don't think about ourselves as having the ability to write or having the ability to author. And I think a lot of the times, that there it must be said that there are difficult CEOs and, the visionaries that are very difficult to control. But ultimately it's down to I'm moving away from nautical references and just thinking about authoring, but it is about our own selves developing the ability to write. And I think that is incredibly important. Thank you so much for bringing the word author in our vocabulary. Thinking about authoring, and generally operational leadership within companies. When we author as COOs and as heads of operations and want to bring those organizations into the top shape, how can we really leverage that operational excellence as a competitive edge, but especially when the seas are really rough? And what are the hallmarks of an operations leader who does not just survive but really thrives in the storm?
No super good short answer I have for this, unfortunately, but I can definitely dig into this, right? So I think let's stick with this idea first about authoring instead of just reacting. And the first thing that I want to say about authoring is actually it's not natural. This is in our evolutionary history as humans, we're trained to react, right? So the analyst comes out more frequently than the sort of dreamer side, or more easily, especially in stormy seas, if we're going to use that. When we're challenged, and if we go back, evolutionary wise, saber-toothed tiger or whatever, in the coming around from the bushes, we react because otherwise we're going to die, right? And so when we get scared or something triggers us, basically our instincts are to react. And instead, there's this time compression thing that happens. And so we react to survival mode, except in the modern world, we're rarely physically at risk. And so part of what we're trying to do, if we want to be authoring, is essentially teach the organization to be authoring so we communicate better, say what we're really thinking, and in a sense, be more strategic, right? So in this, in other words, have a plan, so, and what I'm trying to go with this is to simplify this, if we go back to our stormy seas analogy, and the nautical one, right? What we're really realizing here is, of course, if we do nothing in the stormy season and it hits us, we're going to die. So in other words, not reacting is bad. And that's going to kill us. We can react fully in a sense of the environment. So if we're in our stormy seas, we can batten down the hatches and survive the night, wait for the sunny skies in the morning, and go on our way. But the thing that I'm trying to bring out to here, this is sort of gets back to breaking the dichotomy between these different areas. There actually is a third option here, and this gets into authoring. And it's in the moment, what can we do to realize we're not actually typically in the business environment, physically under life-threatening situations? Let's slow ourselves down just a little bit to realize what we can do to adjust things and take advantage of this thing where most people are going to be batting down the hatches to survive to the morning. In other words, can we change sails and get home early in the stormy weather because it's blowing hard and your boat should be able to go faster? So, that's the thing we're really trying to do there. That's the best option, is this authoring thing. And that's one of the kind of main things that I'm trying to convey here around this. But this is really tricky, right? In other words, all of us as humans want to react. And I think, this makes the authoring aspect of things very tricky. And, the first level of this is realizing yourself that you shouldn't be freaking out. And this comes down to, in a sense, understanding what you want so you can reprioritize or adjust plans. The big struggle in the emergency is figuring out what you want, right? So the storms hit. You do need to know where you're going. You do need to know the capabilities of your boat. You sort of want to constrain the problem. So you're not, but then the other thing to realize too, and this one I learned the hard way, maybe we can get into this a little bit later, but the, lessons learned along the way, which is, we can be very cool and zen ourselves, very strategic and look at this, but then the organization might be freaking out, or people in the organization are freaking out. And the worst thing you can do to somebody freaking out is say, don't freak out, because they want to be reacting and they think you don't understand the severity of the situation, right? So in other words, what we're really looking to do in here is basically acknowledge the fact, yep, there's a storm here. This is bad. Now let's start talking about what we want to do. So we really have to get to the people's fears and flush that out, and then start to switch to authoring mode, basically. So sometimes I talk about this in another analogy, which is, it's basically it's not even like putting out the fires. It's just sort of acknowledge the elephant in the room around the things and talk about it. And it's sort of counterintuitive. People are freaking out. And actually, in a sense, you should be like, oh my God, there's this big thing, but not actually be freaking out in there. Just to understand as an organization that we're empathizing with the problem. And then let's let people start going through the stages of grief, essentially, so we can go back to authoring. And that's the thing that's really here. And then in a sense, you can start taking advantage of the storms, realizing that your competitors and most other people are actually batting down the hatches and just reacting to the fear. And so this is a huge thing that nothing like making good use of a crisis basically to force people and help people get to decisions faster, actually, because there's a real motivator here. In other words, somebody chasing you is a good reason to be running faster, whether it's sort of the fear or whether it's, something more, strategic in the marketplace that we can essentially apply all the time. What do we really mean here, and how do we leverage that? Because we need to know what we want.
So when you're caught in the storm and the waters get rough, how do you, as a leader, truly author and build a resilient strategy that isn't just about weathering the storm, but truly navigating it?
We're talking about this, strategy is important to facilitate the authoring, really, right? So strategy is like often misunderstood or overcomplicated in my view. So the first thing to do is talk about what do we really mean by strategy. And I'm going to say being strategic or a strategy is one very simple idea, which is separating what we want from the current plan that we're using to get there. So, in other words, if we want to be able to author, we got to know where we're going. And authoring basically means adapting the plan based on changing information. And so in a crisis or in any situation, we want to have vocabulary in the organization between what are we trying to go, the dreaming side of things, and just what's the sort of changeable plan that we're applying right now to get there. And in a sense, authoring is adapting the plan for the circumstances to still get to the same goal. But again, because we react, we tend to tunnel in on the plans and try to keep executing the plan or struggle harder or work harder to stay to the same plan rather than realizing the plan itself can change. Now, as a COO, you're a past COO now, but us as senior leaders in the organization, we know that one of the hardest things to do here, we're going to be needing to change plans. It's hard enough to keep people aligned on one plan, let alone changing plans. And the important thing here, I think, to realize is that we actually don't want to really divide up the plan into pieces. We actually want to divide the strategy up into pieces. And this is kind of what OKRs are really all about. If you think about it, is taking this vision we have and coming up with strategic objectives, the O in OKRs, of where we want to go. And then instead of synthesizing at a whole organization level, here's all the plans that translates into, just give people, and this is usually what OKRs are trying to do in a sense, we don't always realize this, is give pieces of the strategy at the objective levels, if you can, all the way down to individual people, and just help them understand that accountability. And so now people are adapting within their own little space. And now the whole thing is just about trusting each other to execute our objectives rather than checklists on plans per se and everywhere across the organization, and enabling people to do that with their each area of accountability. So we switched from like doling out responsibilities at the task level to really doling out and breaking up the accountabilities within the structure of our strategy. And so the strategy can maintain relatively constant. And as long as we all trust each other and communicate well, which is where all the coaching human side of this comes into play, you'll notice that the organization is, I'm going to argue, kind of much more, if not completely self-aligning. Again, as long as we're applying energy to keep people from freaking out and helping them when they are freaking out. So long as we can put the analyst on the shelf most of the time, this is the way we move ourselves forward. And this actually is a kind of a segue, just briefly anyway. I think our tools make this very hard because all of the tools we have are planning tools that talk about articulated plans in the form of Trello boards and Jira tickets and all these different things. We don't have a lot of tool structure around breaking up strategy. And this is actually what Reframe is about, reframing our entire thinking about how we approach running companies, and is what I'm basically spending the majority of my time on now, is figuring out how we build tools to help people author, basically. And this augments all the existing stuff we have. We still have to have tasks at some level across group, individuals or subgroups, but it's really about putting that shape around helping people through the tools to be aligned better to the authoring aspect of things as opposed to the reacting task-driven side of things. I think one of the writing questions we had was something about, what's even one of the hardest decisions they've had as COO, right? And I think, these things when we're in the stormy seas, often in startup environments or earlier stage companies, depending exactly on the structure, this is when money's tight, basically, right? This is where the biggest gut checks come into place. And in my All Works days, it was a successful exit ultimately of this company. We got bought by the major telecom and everything. But there was a time we were in a very serious cash crunch, and we couldn't raise money or couldn't raise it fast enough. And we're coming down to can't make payroll in a certain period of time. You know, the writing's on the wall. And what are we going to do about this? Who are we going to cut? Why are we going to cut? How are we going to cut funding? We basically have to do something. And another element here, you know, was realizing, well, there's another solution here, which is like, we think we can raise money. We just need to get to another sort of proof point. And everybody that we have in the current team, we're all here ready to go to war together. Everybody's really bought into the vision. So, you know, the other thing that comes to mind is, well, maybe we should cut salaries, the equal percentage, and try to get everybody to come along the ride. But then which one do you do and why? You know what I mean? Are people going to go for that? Is it, you know, you're going to have, you know, clearly layoffs are bad. If you're going to actually like terminate people, are you going to cut salaries? That's bad in a different way. What do we do? And ultimately, I don't even know. I think my co-founder I should credit with in this particular one was like us struggling about how we were going to handle the situation and sort of author our way out of it, because we were basically reacting to the money cut, first of all. And he's like, maybe we should ask everybody and just put all of this on the table about where we're at. And people kind of know, and that's the thing as leaders, you don't realize, right? People see it probably earlier than we do in some regards, and what the implications are of the cash crunch. You know, we don't have perfect information. And so, you know, one of the takeaways is this is always involving the team in decisions. And it doesn't mean to ask the team and do consensus necessarily. So this is maybe a little bit more extreme example where we're, you know, actually trying to use the team to help make the decision, especially a big one like this. And ultimately, everybody on the team bought into the idea that we were going to cut salaries for a time and then obviously pay people back with equity and cash once we raised money, which we eventually did and worked our way out of it. But clearly one of the hardest, you know, stressful decisions. I mean, people's lives are involved, all these kind of things. So that's like one really big story I remember is one. And again, the lesson being in there is like realizing that we just didn't have to do the draconian thing there, so to speak, as long as everybody was bought into it. And, you know, ultimately everybody wanted to go along with that. I talked earlier about how not to be freaking out yourself, you know, and this is one of the interesting things. And so I don't know if this will be helpful to people or not, but I remember it wasn't necessarily stormy seas exactly, but I'll call it high stress, right? Like this was at Stack Overflow. The target I signed up for was doubling revenue every year for 5 years in a row. And the rationale for this was when we did a good job raising our Series A, and we wanted to be able to support the business on the fundamentals of the revenue of the company rather than on the sort of the prospect of what Stack Overflow would be worth as a bigger company. And the implication of doing that was to grow 100% year over year for 5 years. So we had these very tall revenue goals. And this was my first time in an operational role with all the sales and marketing and everything reporting to me. And, you know, quarter to quarter, you know what you're trying to do. And as a good operational person and programmer, we had these great dashboards that showed exactly where we were going up to the moment as deals closed. And it was really hard not to like hit F5 on your browser watching the revenue, because you're like, how are we doing against the numbers today? Like real-time information. But it's kind of funny, right? Because it's like, that's almost like too much information. You know, unless I'm going to get in the, you know, in the bullpen making outbound sales calls with salespeople, anything I'm going to do to react to those numbers, you know, in a sense, I'm freaking out, right? To be clear, a bit like, oh my God, what am I doing? Anything that I would do in my job to react to those numbers is probably micromanaging people or just getting unnecessarily distracted about something I don't immediately control. And so it took me a while, you know, with I have an executive coach. I think I talked about that in one of the talks. You know, it's like, what am I really supposed to be doing? What is my real accountability here? And it's like, my accountability is not to close deals. My accountability, in a sense, is to help an organization be set up to close deals and generate leads for those deals and things like that. And you started realizing, like, start worrying about keeping my job and like sort of doing my job. And what is my job there? And it's around this accountability of sales and overall operational excellence. And so it shifts me from this timeline of realizing like, oh, I shouldn't be looking at this month or even this quarter. I can't really affect that very much. Let's talk about where I need to be by the end of the year. How do I author myself to 100% year over year based on the ongoing quarters that I have less control over? And so the net of this was highly predictable revenue. We predicted revenue several years, even beyond the 5-year run that I was talking about, within a few percent year over year, growing at 100% year over year in a startup environment. And this is not about a crystal ball, knowing everything to do. This is literally about learning how to get the entire organization collaboratively authoring together according to what we want to get done and how to do it. And this actually leads to, you know, at this kind of maybe one more example I'll throw out in a minute, which is kind of the other side of the coin with this. And this is in the helping people not freak out. So we had this, what I would consider to be very operationally excellent organization, executing extremely well. And part of us growing in later years when we were going from, $10 million in revenue to 20 million, the numbers are getting bigger, right? And then you're doing, 25 million, and then you need to do 50 million. The hurdle rate's getting higher. And one of the things that we figured out in the business was that we weren't going to get it done a couple $1,000s at a time on the deals that we were doing. And the next innovation of the business was to basically multiply the deal size by 10 and have the deal volume drop a bit, but we were going to continue to grow revenue because one was trading out faster than the other. And through the course of the following 2 years or so that it took to execute this, you got revenue going down in one area of the company while it's fastly going up in a whole different structure. Well, the crossover of these curves while you're trying to grow revenue is obviously very important. And push comes to shove, we were about a quarter off in the exact timing of the trade-off between these. So cash started getting tight in the company because you're growing really fast. I call this the bow wake, where you're consuming cash like crazy. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's also kind of scary when you're waiting for the bottom to dip out on the revenue or the cash burn until it starts going the other way, and you're actually in positive cash flow, no longer burning all the VC money we raised. And we thought we had like $8 or $10 million of buffer, but when you start staring at what looks to be projected, $1 or $2 million of buffer, and that's assuming you really make like a much bigger next quarter, everybody started getting scared. And I had predicted it to happen quicker than that because nobody plans it that tight on purpose. And the entire organization's freaking out about it, basically, not in the part that was operationally responsible for generating the revenue, but like a product-led organization with a visionary founder struggling to see, like, they just didn't know the business as well as me. And I'm basically like, this is the don't freak out thing, and us and the operational team could explain 6 ways from Sundays why this was going to be fine and it's just going to get tight. But they're all freaking out and they think I don't get it, basically, or we don't get it as an organization. And as a team, including like even the board, decided to pull the plug and do cutbacks and pull down the line of credit to make sure we're going to raise money. Because if we didn't deliver, it's obviously sort of, I wouldn't call it catastrophic, but there's going to be a hard down round ahead of us that could, really affect our ownership percentage in the company or investors on the table. So it became very scary. And the numbers did exactly what we expected to, except we pulled the panic button as an organization to do the cuts, even though all the money we drew down, paid it back within we never used it basically, and even gave the money back to the bank, 3 months after we pulled on it, and didn't need to raise money again, except for another wave of growth a couple of years later. And so the lesson in this, though, is this idea that I probably should have been out there like, oh my God, this is going to get tight, and give people things to do to help them author rather than panic, basically, right? That's probably the real lesson behind that kind of situation. And that had massive impacts, but, obviously the company was, I would call that maybe an unforced error because it didn't bring people on the journey the way it needed to. So I wasn't freaking out enough, in a sense, from the perspective of everybody else.
Well, you wouldn't be sitting here telling the story if you did not experience the lesson. So, on your behalf, maybe it was not a very pleasant lesson to go through. But thank you so much for sharing. I think this is really important, and we can all, listen back to you and learn from that experience. I have one last question for you, Jeff, about essentially the operational debt, because a lot of the times we're caught in this classic trap of once we get through this, then we will start behaving differently, or we will start doing things in a different way, and this thinking really contributes to the operational debt. And a lot of the times it's when the seas are stormy and we don't think we have the time to author. So how do you advise to dodge that bullet and make sure that your current actions don't clash with the future objectives?
Right. Yeah. So you're getting into the sort of the once XYZ happens, then we'll be more, the fire drill's over, the firefighting's over, we're gonna like change modes, right? Like that's the thing. There's actually a movie called Once. You wouldn't know it from the title, but the whole theme of the movie is exactly about this phenomenon. Actually, people running their lives on the sort of once thing. It's a really good movie if you haven't seen it. I think it's set in the UK, actually, if I remember correctly. It's sort of a musical, but super interesting movie. So yeah, what's the once fallacy is, like what are we doing to avoid this? How do we avoid it? Because like there is stormy seas at times, and we do have to make nearer term decisions. So the shortest answer to this question is yes, we do have to take on water, if you will, whatever in our stormy seas analogy. We do have to do short-term things. Layoffs may need to happen, cutbacks need to happen. But the key is to have a way out, right? Like in other words, don't just take on the organizational debt or the short-termist thing and then figure out what to do later. To realize that take a day, and this is where the strategy comes in, take a day, take a week, whatever. There is some period of time. It's very rarely we're talking about hours or even days that these decisions need to be made. Make sure that when we implement a plan in the once sort of thinking that we also know how we're going to get out of it, and realize that we need to be authoring the whole way through. Because if it's once without a plan in the back end, I'm going to just describe that as purely reacting to the situation. And again, as we talked about earlier, that's certainly better than dying, right? Like in other words, you can't do nothing. And this is where our fears come in and this sort of human nature. We feel like we have to react. We want to immediately start feeling better by doing something. But in a lot of ways, we're kind of making the problem worse if we're not careful, because there's always tomorrow's fire drills and changes and new information that we have to react to. So this is why the once fallacy is the fallacy, is because we think this is the last one we're going to do and then we're going to get out of it. How we shift from reacting to authoring is to know how we're undoing, in a sense. Don't make it a side distraction as a once. Make it part of your new plan within the context of the strategy of where we were going before. And hopefully that makes sense. Like that's the fundamental thing. And I think the biggest tool we have in this area is people are freaking out and there's new information and things had to change. People tend to try to inflict as little change as possible because it feels like the more changes we make, the more changes that we make, that this is peppering people harder. But what I've learned through my career is you want to kind of make one clear set of decisions immediately that give you the buffer and the cushion. So what we're meaning in practice here is prioritize very strictly down to the things that you can do well with the resources you now have in play. So in other words, another way of looking at this is a lot of times we will make certain cuts in the organization, but we're still trying to do the same things, and we just push people harder. This kind of wrecks psychological safety. This puts everybody in reaction mode. What you really want to do is figure out what you can now do well so people can rebuild confidence and moving forward and go, in a sense, back to authoring. Or if you're kind of doing this whole thing, beginning to end, then you're just authoring your way through this thing out of it. We're just basically adapting the plans within this new context to get ourselves to where we need to be, just using a different way of getting there. And this, again, where I was talking about earlier, like, let's use the crisis in a sense to help us prioritize, like, what things were we doing? Because we kind of had the resources, or we thought we had the resources to do things. Clearly when things get tighter, in a sense, cut deeper once so that we can be confident that we can actually deliver on those things. Otherwise, we're just changing plans all the time, which means we're reacting all the time. And that's the once fallacy, in a sense.
I love it. I love the cuts deeper ones. I think so many organizations and also so many companies that I've even myself been at before, we make short slivers, shortcuts, hoping that they're going to heal very soon. But ultimately, the last cut is the deepest. So I think it's a really, really good, really good advice. Thank you so much, Jeff. I think we're going to go into the Q&A session now. And we had a lot of people submit quite a few questions before the session. So let me kick off with one of them.
When the seas get rough, operations teams are often the first ones to get thrown overboard, mainly because everyone sees ops as an unnecessary cost center. What would you advise to those operations leaders on the call who want to protect their teams and the value they can deliver in the stormy seas?
I don't know to be honest, I don't know if I have the best answer to this. It's like, maybe the one would be, the best defense is a good offense around this. So meaning that, because at some level I want to question the premise of the question in terms of what we're actually looking at when this is occurring, right? So So if we think about operations as cleaning up the messes, and people feel like they're in an urgent situation, they're reacting, and their reaction is to cut these things that feel more optional, because that's, you know, the other things that are not the sales or whatever the product led / sales led or whatever the leading part of the organization is, and we somehow see the operation stuff as in a different priority. That dichotomy that we're talking about is the exact thing I'm getting at. That part of what we're trying to fix, I'm going to claim, by authoring and teaching the entire organization around operational excellence and decomposing into the strategic pieces, starts to change the perception of operations. The way I think we could think about this in a visceral sense, if operations is preceded as we're the rule enforcers, we're the traffic cops here. Oh, no, can't do that. Got to fill out this form. Got to do this thing. No, you got to use these tools. Like, in some sense, they feel bothered by the operational people all the time. I know, Aušrine, you and I have talked about this before quite a bit, where, you know, we're a service organization on the operations side of things. Our customer is the rest of the organization. If we feel more like a traffic cop, then in some ways it's like, you know, especially when they're under stress, they don't want to talk to it anymore. Like, the easiest thing they can do is stop listening to those people and or say that's the first thing we want to cut back. Or, you know, maybe in a practical sense, if the CEO or whoever is going to be making these decisions goes to the CFO first to say, like, okay, we got to go find this amount of money here in the budget. Tell me where I can cut. These people are going to make the decision from a less optimal reacting perspective, probably, than if we really have the accountability as operations people, or the COO as operational excellence. We should be viewed as like the oracle, giving you the answers about how we're going to engineer ourselves out of this without giving up that much. In other words, we're going to give you a new plan, and, you know, don't make the mistake that I made, you know, earlier on around, you know, don't panic, everybody. This is not a problem. That's actually the defensive strategy that I'm saying you want to avoid. It's like, yes, this is serious. Here's what we're going to do. And I think the hint that you're getting this right is that people come to you for advice when they make those plans. They're not sort of doing it without your involvement in helping us figure out how to author this. And the key thing, and I talk about this all the time, and I know it's hard for this to feel this way in the crisis, but like, the hygiene around a clear strategy being in place is our first line of defense here, and, you know, building our offense to help people go through this, right? Like, in other words, if everybody clearly understands the difference between our plans and our goals, then it's easier to talk about how we're going to react by authoring, rather than saying, like, oh, in these plans, let's just, you know, defund these things over there and we'll just keep this other stuff going. You know, we're battening down the hatches. It's the second, you know, it's better than doing nothing, as we talked about, but it's really very suboptimal to the authoring outcome there, if that makes sense. I don't know. Do you feel like it's a helpful answer? Yeah. It's a lot.
I think it is. I think there's so many discussions around this, and so many questions for us, and so many tactics that we have all used to get ourselves out of the situation over time. But I think this is really, really helpful. And this actually leads me to the next question, or combination of questions that we had submitted before the talk, which is about validation. As an operations leader, as an operations professional, because a lot of the times, purely because of the reason that we're just reacting and we're not authoring, and maybe your answer is going to be, well, author more, but how do you validate yourself? Is it, if it is, we can just skip this one. No, how do you validate yourself as an operations leader? How do you document, how do you communicate your achievements as a COO? Because I think after leading organizations, especially after stormy times, you can say that, yes, I have weathered the storm, but over the longer term, how do you know that as a COO you're doing a good job, and how can you say it to others? How do you measure yourself as an operations professional?
Right. Okay, yeah. So I might be choosing to answer this question my own way, or interpret it my own way, but I think, like, you know, to the extent that we're trying to feel or, you know, be validated in the eyes of the organization, I think that's very similar to the other question we just talked about, right? So there's that one. But to make this a less boring answer, we can talk about our internal validation, which is similar, but, like, in other words, how do we get confidence that we're having the right job here and that we're doing the right things? And I think, you know, this is where I like having, you know, there's a sort of I have a core checklist around this. You know, the first thing is understanding that here's the thing that's the thing we really need to confront, you know, as COOs, right? And especially when you have a visionary founder, like I was talking about, it's a very common situation where the COO has been hired for a reason. And we, again, as I talked about very early on in our session here, around, people are largely and often frustrated with their founder CEO, myself included, certainly at different points or phases in the company. And the thing I've come to realize around this is that if you're a COO or this head of ops, I guess, in this sort of taking over accountability of operational excellence sense, regardless of title, if the CEO isn't making you, you can't, you control your own feelings is probably the first side, is we're getting frustrated because that's an internally generated thing, frustration. People can stimulate us in various ways, and then us internally becoming frustrated is actually just our internal behavior. But where I'm going with this is that if our CEO never frustrated us and was always aligned, they probably didn't need the COO in the first place. In other words, they're taking on operational excellence is a core part of the COO job and are tasking out the things into the operational structures that made those people's jobs easier. So in a way, what I'm saying is if you're going to take on this accountability, it's by definition, this is actually the job, is taking on the accountability for getting alignment in the organization. And so the way to feel validated here is that you don't have to come up with the strategy, but it's actually really owning this with the CEO and saying, like, let's talk more about what we're trying to do here and why, and figure out how to author this together. You're the visionary founder. You're thinking 3 to 5 years out. I'm thinking, half a year to 3 years out, somewhere in there, to bridge the gap together as a team and getting that alignment. And the validation comes from the fact that you're the trusted advisor as part of this dynamic, two people truly running the company together in some division of those accountabilities, right? And so that, me personally feels incredibly validated when their first thing is like, hey, Jeff, we got this thing I'm seeing. What are we going to do? You know what I mean? And everybody in the organization that's coming to ops realizing that it's going to help their jobs become easier. I am struggling with these things. I'm confronting these things. And they're coming to your team for questions rather than you trying to traffic cop them by beat them up about things they should be doing that they're not doing. You can see that that's much more helpful and really kind of answers both questions in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that is definitely something that each operations team and each operations leader should really strive for, to be the go-to, but also for all the teams in the organization to keep operational excellence in mind, so that they don't even need to sometimes go to operations teams, and everyone has their own agency and they execute it across the board, and everyone is going in the same direction. Brilliant. We have just one more question from the attendees, and it's asking for your recommendations to reignite the team morale following resource cuts, especially when people were let go, and we need to have the team to do more with less.
Yeah, at least, I mean, the one thing that comes to mind, we touched on it a little bit, right? So yeah, we got these constrained resources. The first thing is that, if we're going to need to do cuts, I talked about getting to a solid base before. You definitely don't want to do multiple layoffs, right? Because the psychological safety is gone. And you can think of like the breakdown in trust, or people worried about their jobs or looking for another job because they might lose theirs. Everybody gets really scared in these situations. First of all, so we got to kind of do it once and over, and then explain people why this is once and over. So, I'm not saying necessarily, somewhere within the team, we've got to decide who and how we're cutting and why. Transparency is super helpful here. Again, showing people and building confidence about that we're authoring our way out of this. We're not just reacting, and we'll have to continue to keep reacting as things get worse, or we don't actually fix the problem, right? So this gets down to, because the other thing that's going to torture people not only would be additional sort of layoffs, but the other one's going to be, we were essentially asking them to do more and pretend like, push hard, we're going to really try. These things sound good. Super high trust environments, you can kind of get away with that, at least for short periods of time. But if it's, it's a once thing, we get to XYZ more money and everything's going to be better, that you better be able to put a box around that, or you're going to lose more trust, break trust again, or whatever, how you want to look at that. So this gets into, not only overworking people, right? So we really got to relax it. And again, this is against all of our normal survival instincts that we think, working longer hours, working harder. We really got to think of the psychological safety around people and start to rebuild the trust. And then this goes, within the org team all the way down to every single person around what they can do to control the outcome. In other words, help them understand how they can author themselves out of this as well. And that rebuilding of things is really the way out of this. So that, again, we get away from the one's fallacy. focus down to a tight set of things that we know we can do well. And then it's also too that there's no one solution at mass scale here. You know, we're going to communicate things. We're going to be really clear. We're going to be transparent. But basically, you got to get to every single person in the organization, hopefully knowing ahead of time before these things happen. You know, what makes people tick? What are they actually worried about? And figure out how to have the right conversation with everybody so they can get back to authoring mode as opposed to staying in this reaction mode. Because I think that's the symptom of what's happening there. If we break it down to one thing.
100%. I think the running topic of this talk is you know, be more proactive, be authoring, be less reactive. And I think a lot of the times it is, you know, maybe one thing to remember, and one thing, if you take only one thing from this conversation, from this talk, from Jeff, it is the authoring. It is exercising your agency, and it is allowing others in your organization to do exactly this. Jeff, thank you so much. This has been incredible. Really appreciate sharing your wisdom, and I'm also incredibly lucky to work with you every day, and hear more of that. So looking forward to our conversations and sharing all your wisdom and nuggets with the community.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate
very
it.
kind. Very kind.
Hopefully to see you. Hopefully we'll see you back at another Operations Nation event very soon.